My name is Audrey Whitlock. I am 32 years old, and I work as a hospice social worker in Des Moines, Iowa. 3 years after my parents forced me to leave my husband so my sister could have him, Blaire walked back through the front door of our family home wearing my old wedding ring like it had never belonged to anyone else. She hugged my mother first, then my father. Then she stepped back and looked at me from my shoes to my hair, slow enough to make sure I felt every inch of it. "Still the responsible one?" she said, smiling. "That must be exhausting." Caleb stood behind her with a bottle of wine nobody had asked for. My ex-husband. Her husband now. He glanced at my sweater, my hospice badge still clipped near the pocket, and gave a small laugh. "Still doing hospice work?" he said. "I guess somebody has to enjoy sad endings." Nobody corrected him. My mother, Judith, only pressed her napkin flat beside her plate and said, "Let's not start tonight. Your father needs peace." That was how my family worked. Blaire could walk into a room wearing the evidence of what she took from me. Caleb could mock the work that kept dying people from being alone, and somehow I was still the danger to the evening. My father sat at the head of the dining table, thinner than he had been 3 years ago, his right hand trembling against the arm of the chair. Parkinson's had taken his balance first, then his handwriting, then the quiet confidence of a man who used to know every property line in Polk County by memory. But that night his eyes were clear. He reached down beside his chair, lifted a blue file box onto the table, and set it between the pot roast and Caleb's untouched wine. "Good," he said. "Everyone who signed something is finally in one room." In the next 52 minutes, my ex-husband's pharmacy license would become a question mark, my sister would beg me for mercy, and the house they came to sell would disappear behind a legal wall they could not touch. But the blue file box was not the part that broke me. By the next morning, Blaire understood one thing clearly. The house in Norwalk was not going on the market, not that week, not that winter. Not because Caleb needed money fast, and not because my mother needed a story soft enough to make theft sound like family planning. I learned that at 8:17 a.m., sitting in my car outside Willowbend assisted living with a paper cup of coffee cooling between my knees, when Miles Keene called and said, "Your sister's attorney wants to know whether the property transfer can be reversed." I stared through the windshield at the front garden. A groundskeeper was replacing yellow mums along the walkway, the same kind my father used to plant by the mailbox every fall before his hands started shaking too badly to hold a trowel. "Can it?" I asked. Miles gave one dry little laugh. "Not unless your father becomes 20 years younger and forgets every document he signed 2 days before they walked into that dining room." The house was inside an irrevocable care trust now. So were the 6 acres behind it, the old tool shed, the garden strip my mother always said attracted rabbits, and the narrow line of cottonwoods where Blaire and I used to hide when we were children and still believed hiding together meant we were on the same side. My father had signed everything with Dr. Simon Vale's capacity letter attached. Witnessed, notarized, scanned, backed up, and filed. Alton Whitlock had spent 38 years as a county assessor. He knew the difference between a promise and a record. By the time Blaire and Caleb sat at that dining table, their plan was already older than the documents that killed it. That should have felt like victory. It did not. Victory would have been my mother saying, "Audrey, I am sorry we made you carry what belonged to all of us." Victory would have been Caleb looking at my face before he looked at his license. Instead, what I got was a stack of legal paper and 48 hours. 48 hours for Blaire and Caleb to sign a repayment agreement for $200,350. 48 hours before Miles sent the civil complaint. 48 hours before the county attorney received the financial exploitation packet. And the pharmacy board complaint, Miles told me, was not part of the bargain. "That one is yours," he said. "You decide when it leaves your hands." I looked down at the sealed envelope on the passenger seat. My name was written in the complainant box, and my social work license number was underneath it. Not as a threat, not as revenge. As a professional obligation I had spent my whole adult life teaching other families not to ignore. Still, my hand would not touch it, because once that envelope went out, Caleb would not be able to smile his way through it, and Blaire would not be able to cry it smaller. My mother would not be able to call it a misunderstanding over pot roast and pie. It would become what it had always been beneath their soft words. A record. And records do not care who survives the shame. But to understand why that blue file box scared them more than shouting ever could, I have to take you back 3 years, to the night my mother looked at me across her kitchen table and explained, in the gentlest voice she owned, why my marriage had to become my sister's second chance. 3 years earlier, I was still Mrs. Caleb Hensley on paper. We had been married 5 years, long enough for love to become ordinary in the way most marriages do. Bills on the counter, laundry waiting in the dryer, his pharmacy conferences on one calendar, my hospice families on another. I worked late, Caleb worked proud. Proud of the white coat, the license, and the way people lowered their voices when they asked him about medication. Blaire moved back into my parents' house that March after her boutique closed. My mother called it a temporary reset, which was how Judith Whitlock described any disaster she did not want to name. Blaire was 26 then, beautiful in the fragile way that made people bring casseroles and forget receipts. "Your sister is not built like you," Mom told me. "She feels things deeper." Daughters like me learn early that arguing with a compliment only makes you look ungrateful. At first, Caleb was just helping Blaire move boxes out of the failed shop, helping her understand the lease penalty, helping her choose a new phone plan because she was too overwhelmed to talk to customer service. I did not like the way she said his name, but disliking something and proving something are not the same thing. In hospice, you learn not to call time of death before the pulse is gone. So, I watched. I waited. Then one Thursday evening, my last patient canceled, and I drove home early through rain that made every brake light bleed red across the windshield. Caleb's truck was not in our driveway. I found it at my parents' house, parked near the side fence where the kitchen window could not see. Blaire was in the passenger seat. Caleb was turned toward her, wiping tears from her cheek with his thumb. It was not a kiss. Somehow that made it worse. A kiss can be called a mistake. Tenderness takes time. I walked into the house before either of them saw me. My mother was already at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad in front of her and 6 apartment listings printed beside her coffee. 1 bedroom. Reasonable commute. Utilities included. Circled in blue ink. That is the detail I remember most. My marriage had been given a budget before I had been given a sentence. Mom looked up and said, "Before you make this ugly, I need you to think about what your sister has been through." By the time Caleb and Blaire came inside, my father was sitting at the far end of the table, both hands wrapped around a glass of water to hide the tremor. Blaire cried first. Caleb said he needed space. My mother had already chosen where that space would be, outside my own marriage. Then she looked at me with those calm, wet choir, director eyes and said, "Blaire won't survive losing him. You will, Audrey. You have always been our steady girl." I asked, "What about me?" Nobody answered. My father looked down. His silence did not feel like illness then. It felt like permission. Caleb looked at the floor. Blaire looked at my mother, because even then, she knew where the verdict lived. And that was the night I understood something I should have known, years earlier. In my family, being strong did not mean they protected you. It meant they knew exactly where to put the weight. The apartment I moved into had beige carpet, a humming refrigerator, and 1-bedroom window facing the brick wall of a dentist's office. My mother called it practical. Caleb called it temporary. Blaire never called it anything, because Blaire did not call me at all. I unpacked my clothes into a dresser someone had left beside the dumpster and put my wedding photos in the bottom drawer beneath winter sweaters. Not because I was noble, because I could not stand being watched by the version of me who still believed Caleb had chosen her. 11 days later, Caleb's truck was parked outside Blaire's apartment complex. I know because I passed it on my way to a hospice intake in West Des Moines and had to pull into a gas station until my hands remembered how to steer. 3 months after that, My cousin Marin sent me a screenshot, with no message attached. Blaire and Caleb were engaged. Her ring was smaller than mine had been, which should not have mattered, except pain notices stupid things when the important things are too large to hold. My mother told people at church that I had chosen peace. I heard it from Ruth Fenwick in the parking lot after Sunday service, beside a row of minivans and one maple tree dropping leaves on the pavement. Ruth touched my arm and said, "Your mother says you're handling everything with grace." I looked toward the church doors, where Judith was laughing with two women from choir, her hand pressed to her chest, like the story had moved her. "That sounds like Mom," I said. It was the only answer I could give without making Ruth carry something that belonged in my mother's kitchen. The wedding was in September, at a vineyard near Madison County. All white chairs, and soft music and sunlight, polished for pictures. I was not invited. My mother said it would be too hard on everyone, and by everyone, she meant the people who had done the taking. I found out the exact time of the ceremony, because a cousin posted a video of Blaire walking down the aisle under a wooden arch, wrapped in eucalyptus. Caleb cried when he saw her. I watched that part twice, not because I wanted to, but because disbelief sometimes makes you check the wound again. She wore ivory. He wore a sage boutonniere. That color stopped me more than the dress did. Sage had been the color Caleb and I chose for the vow renewal we kept postponing until the marriage underneath it went missing. Under the first photo, Blaire wrote, "Sometimes God writes love stories we never expected." I was sitting in my car, outside the home of a man named Harold, who had died 20 minutes earlier, while his wife held his hand. My palms still smelled like lavender lotion from the bottle she had asked me to open because grief had made her fingers weak. I turned my phone face down on the passenger seat and drove to my parents' house. Alton had a neurology appointment the next morning, and Judith had already texted me twice asking where his insurance card was, though it had been in the same kitchen drawer for 6 years. No one asked if I had eaten. They asked if I knew where Dad's Medicare folder was. That was the part nobody posted. Not the pill bottles lined up by morning and evening. Not the tremor that made my father button his shirt with both hands. Not my mother saying, "I just can't look at paperwork today," when paperwork meant keeping the man she married from falling through the cracks. So while Blaire became Mrs. Hensley in a vineyard, I became the daughter who knew which pharmacy filled Dad's carbidopa levodopa, which chair he could rise from without help, and which hallway rug had to be removed before winter. My marriage had been rewritten as a generous exit. My absence from the wedding had been called maturity. In my family, strength was not something they admired. It was the excuse they used to send me back into the fire with a clean shirt and a full pill organizer. By winter, my father's Parkinson's had become part of the house, not dramatic enough for neighbors to whisper about, but present in every room if you knew where to look. It lived in the coffee he spilled and blamed on the mug. It lived in the second handrail I installed by the basement steps. It lived in the way he stopped carrying full plates from the kitchen to the table, pretending he preferred to eat at the counter. My week stopped belonging to days, and started belonging to tasks. Refills before breakfast, therapy after lunch, soup containers on Fridays, pill organizers on Sunday nights. I bought a medical alert pendant he refused to wear until I called it a keychain. Judith said handwriting on freezer labels made the kitchen look like a clinic, so I used blue painter's tape and block letters small enough for her to ignore. Blaire sent heart emojis in the family thread. Caleb sent supplement articles with no source links. My mother forwarded both to me, as if participation and responsibility were cousins. Judith loved the word "we" because it let her stand close to the work without touching it. We're adjusting his medication. We're keeping him comfortable at home. We're looking into fall prevention. But we usually meant me, with a phone pressed between my shoulder and ear, while a hospice nurse waited for my signature on another family's paperwork. My mother folded choir bulletins at the kitchen table, and told me Blaire had always had a gift for making people feel special. I started keeping a gray care binder, because work had taught me that memory is kind until money gets involved. Inside were appointment notes, medication changes, fall risks, insurance letters, therapy instructions, and receipts clipped by month. In the back, behind a divider I did not label, I kept the things nobody asked for. The nights Dad called because his legs would not move toward the bathroom, the mornings his shirt buttons beat him, the grocery trips where he stood in the cereal aisle with both hands on the cart, embarrassed by how long choosing had started to take. One Sunday in February, I found him in the bedroom, trying to button a blue dress shirt for church. The top 2 buttons were wrong. The third was halfway through the wrong hole. His hands shook harder each time he failed, which only made the shaking worse. "Go tell your mother I'll be down in 5, he said, still looking at the shirt. He used the voice men use when they are trying to dismiss a witness from the scene of an accident. I stepped inside and closed the door halfway. "Let me help." He did not answer. For a moment, I thought pride would win. Then his hands dropped to his sides, empty and furious. I fixed the buttons from the bottom up, so he would not have to watch my face. Neither of us spoke until I reached the collar. Then he looked past my shoulder, at the mirror over the dresser, and said, "You're the one who comes before the shaking gets bad." It was not an apology. It was not even thank you. But it landed in a place inside me that had been waiting for proof that someone knew the difference between being useful and being used. I smoothed the collar, picked a thread off his sleeve, and said, "I try to." His eyes met mine in the mirror. Clear eyes, tired eyes, eyes that had measured land, houses, fence lines, and flood maps, yet somehow still missed the daughter standing in front of him 3 years earlier. Downstairs, Judith called that we were going to be late, as if time had become rude on purpose. At church, Blaire's photo was still on the bulletin board from a fundraiser she had not attended, smiling beside Caleb under the words Community Health Partners. My mother pointed to it while Dad shuffled toward the pew and whispered, "At least she's building something stable now." I looked at my father's hand, gripping my arm, each step a negotiation. Blaire got to build, I got to hold. And somehow, my family kept calling both things love. By March, I had stopped expecting fairness to announce itself. It usually arrived disguised as a receipt, a date that did not match, or a line on a statement someone thought I was too tired to read. The first one was folded under the salt shaker on the kitchen table, half covered by a church newsletter. Prairie Home Wellness Coordination. $1,950. The memo said monthly care planning. I stood there with my coat still on, reading it twice while Dad slept in the recliner, and Judith hummed in the laundry room like paper could not make noise if nobody reacted to it. I asked my mother about it while she matched socks at the kitchen table. She did not look up. "Blaire found them," she said. "She said they help families organize complicated care." That word again. Families. I asked who had come to the house. Judith frowned, like I had asked something rude. "Audrey, not everything has to go through you." Behind her, my gray binder sat beside the toaster, swollen with the work that apparently did not count as going through me. No nurse had called. No coordinator had visited. And coordinators always call the person who actually coordinates. The next month, Prairie Home charged $2,175. Then came a custom medication review for $875. Caleb's pharmacy name appeared beside that one in small print, neat and confident. I texted him a photo of the line and asked, "Who completed Dad's medication review?" He waited 4 hours to answer, long enough to make silence feel professional. Then he wrote, "Let's not blur roles here. You're helpful with hands-on care, but financial medical coordination is more complex." I read it in the hospital parking lot, sitting under a light that flickered like it was trying not to witness me. That night, I added a new section to the binder. Not because I knew what was happening, because something in my body did. I wrote the date, the charge, the description, and under service provided, I wrote, "No visit, no call, no report received." The words looked small on the page, too small for what they meant. But I had spent years telling families that small notes become timelines, and timelines become truth when everyone else starts remembering differently. So I kept writing. Prairie Home, medication review, caregiver scheduling support. Names that sounded gentle enough to hide behind. In April, Judith mentioned a church restoration donation over dinner, casual as passing the butter. Blaire arranged something in your father's name, she said. A blessing, really. $27,750 toward repairs. My fork stopped halfway to my mouth. Our church roof was old, but not that old, and Ruth Fenwick had run that treasury for 20 years with the caution of a woman who could smell a missing nickel through a sealed envelope. I asked if Ruth had confirmed it. Judith's face closed. Must you make generosity sound suspicious? Dad looked at his plate. His hand trembled against the napkin. That was when I understood the shape of it, if not the size. They were not stealing with one big dramatic grab. They were sanding my father's future down in smooth, respectable strokes. A coordination fee here, a review there, a donation wrapped in hymnals and good intentions. And every time I asked a question, my mother made the question uglier than the charge. So I did what I knew how to do. I documented. I clipped copies. I wrote dates. I wrote who was present. I wrote what did not happen. Because in my family, silence had always protected the loudest person in the room. This time, I wanted it to protect the record. The fall happened on a Tuesday morning in August, which felt cruel in a way I did not have language for yet. Tuesdays had become the day I trusted the most. The day I checked pill bottles, washed coffee cups, changed sheets, and let myself believe that routine could hold a body together if love was careful enough. I was at a hospice facility outside Des Moines when my phone rang at 9:38. Etta Raines's name lit up the screen. Etta did not call unless someone was dead, lost, or standing too close to one of those doors. Her voice came through thin and breathless. "Honey, your father is on the garage floor." That was all she needed to say. I was already walking before she finished. My supervisor saw my face and took the folder out of my hand without asking. By the time I reached the car, Etta had called 911. Judith had not answered twice. Blaire's phone went straight to voicemail, and Caleb's pharmacy receptionist told me he was with a supplier. There are moments when a family tree turns into a contact list, and every branch fails in order. Dad had been trying to pull a plastic toolbox from the second shelf. Later, Etta told me she heard a faint tapping through the shared garage wall, soft enough that she almost blamed the pipes. He had been down 47 minutes, not hours. Not long enough for tragedy to announce itself with sirens in your memory. 47 minutes is ordinary time. A load of laundry, a church luncheon, a pharmacist's meeting, a daughter driving too fast past soybean fields with one hand on the wheel and the other pressed against her mouth. Nothing was broken, which everyone kept saying like it meant nothing had happened. His hip was bruised, his elbow was scraped. His pride had a fracture no X-ray could name. Doctor. Simon Vale met us that afternoon, looked at the notes, the tremor, the freezing episodes I had tracked, and said, "This is the warning you get before the fall, that changes everything." He did not soften it. I respected him for that. Some sentences are cruel only because they arrive before the coffin. I toured Willowbend 2 days later. I expected to hate it. Instead, I found a first-floor room with a window facing a bird garden, rails along every hallway, physical therapy in the building, and staff who did not talk over my father just because his hands shook. Gloria Pike, the director, slid the packet across her desk and said, "We can hold it until Friday. Deposit, $12,000. Monthly care, $8,450. Terrifying numbers, unless you remembered the $280,000 my father had set aside for exactly this kind of mourning." I gave Gloria the account information with the strange, fragile relief of someone finally using an umbrella in a storm. She typed, waited, frowned, and tried again. Then she looked up with the careful face professionals use when money has become bad news. "It's not going through." I actually smiled because I thought she meant a routing error. "Run it again," I said. She did. The answer stayed the same. Insufficient funds. Outside her office, A woman with silver hair was laughing at a therapy dog in the hallway. Inside, my father's safety had just been declined by a machine. The bank could tell me almost nothing, because my name was not on the account. Almost nothing is still enough when the thing you need to know is gone. The teller lowered her voice and said, "Audrey, it is low, around $3,180. I sat in my car afterward with Willowbend's packet on my lap and my hospice badge still clipped to my sweater. Then I took out my own debit card, walked back inside, and paid the deposit from the savings account I had built to leave Iowa. "Hold the room," I told Gloria. "My father is coming." I paid the deposit at 2:14 p.m. By 3:06, I had emailed Blaire with the subject line "Dad's Care Fund" and a message so plain it almost looked bloodless. Willowbend accepted him. Deposit paid from my personal savings because the care account would not process. We need a full review of all statements by Friday. I attached the receipt, the failed transfer notice, and Dr. Vale's recommendation. Then I sat at my kitchen table and watched the sent message sit there like a match waiting to find oxygen. Blaire did not answer that day. Or the next. On the third morning, she posted a photo of Caleb standing in front of Hensley Family Pharmacy, one hand on the glass door, smiling under a banner that said, "Community Wellness Starts Here." She captioned it, "Proud of the life we're building." I stared at the word building for longer than I should have. Some people build with lumber. Some build with invoices. Some build with the future of a man who still says thank you when a stranger helps him stand. Her reply came that evening, soft enough to bruise. "Hey Aud, just seeing this, big decisions shouldn't come from fear. Caleb and I are coming home next weekend, and we'll all sit down like a family. Dad deserves that." There was a heart at the end, because Blaire believed punctuation could launder anything. No apology, no explanation, no offer to reimburse the $12,000. Just a delay dressed up as respect, sent by a woman who knew Friday had already passed. Caleb called an hour later from the pharmacy line. I knew because the caller ID said Hensley Family Pharmacy, which felt less like a business name and more like an accusation. He skipped hello. "Audrey, Willowbend is emotional spending." His voice had that smooth countertone pharmacists use with frightened people holding prescription bags. "There are facilities half that price. Your father doesn't need boutique care. He needs structure, medication, consistency, and realistic financial planning." I was standing beside my stove, heating soup I no longer wanted. "He needs Parkinson's support," I said. "He needs fall response. He needs staff who won't park him in front of a television and call it supervision." Caleb sighed, not loud, just enough to remind me. He had once made that sound across our dinner table when I mispronounced the name of one of his professors. "You're a social worker, Audrey. This is a medical and financial decision." There it was, the same old staircase, his license on the top step. My work somewhere near the basement. I asked him which facility he recommended. He named a place 40 minutes away with one secured wing, no Parkinson's program, and a violation history I had already read before my soup went cold. The next morning, Blaire sent a PDF titled Family Property Transition Plan. 6 pages, clean font. Caleb's fingerprints all over the phrasing. Sell the Norwalk house before winter maintenance costs increased. Sell the 6 acres behind it as a separate parcel. Move Dad into a more cost-conscious care environment. Place remaining proceeds into a family-managed healthcare investment connected to Caleb's pharmacy expansion. My personal deposit would be reimbursed when liquidity allowed. I read that line twice. Liquidity was what they called my savings, after they had finished calling my pain maturity. Judith called before I could answer. "Your sister is trying," she said. "You have to meet her halfway." I looked at the PDF on my laptop, at the house reduced to an asset, my father reduced to a cost center, and my $12,000 reduced to a future courtesy. "Mom," I said, "this is Dad's care money." She inhaled sharply, like I had cursed in church. "Blaire has carried enough shame. Don't make this harder." For 1 second, the whole story clarified. 3 years earlier, I had been asked to leave my marriage because Blaire could not survive losing Caleb. Now I was being asked to risk my father's safety because Blaire could not survive being accountable. That night, I printed every page of the plan and slid it into the gray binder behind the failed transfer notice. My hands were steady. That scared me more than shaking would have. Rage, when it becomes organized, feels almost peaceful. I added one more note beneath Caleb's facility recommendation. No Parkinson's program, prior inspection deficiencies, 40-minute emergency distance. Then I wrote the sentence I had been avoiding since Willowbend. They are not delaying care. They are positioning the house. And once I saw it written down, I knew the next conversation could not happen over email. It had to happen in a room where nobody could delete what they said. I drove to my parents' house late Friday with the gray binder on the passenger seat and the printed property plan tucked behind the failed transfer notice. The sky over Norwalk had gone that low summer gray that makes every farmhouse look older than it is. I had rehearsed one sentence the whole way there. Dad, did you let them do this? Not because I wanted to accuse him, because the alternative was worse. If he had not let them, then he had been robbed. If he had, then I had spent 3 years caring for a man who watched me bleed and called it strategy. The house was dark except for the yellow square of light in his study. My mother's television murmured from the living room, some home renovation show where problems were fixed between commercials. I let myself in through the side door and stood for a moment beside the kitchen table, looking at the place where my marriage had been divided like leftovers. Then I picked up the binder and walked down the hall. Before I knocked, my father said, "Come in, Audrey." He did not sound surprised. That frightened me more than if he had. He was sitting at his desk in a cardigan, thinner than he had been in February, one hand resting flat on a blue file box I had never seen open. The tremor moved through his fingers, but his eyes were steady. I laid my binder in front of him and talked for 8 minutes. Prairie Home, the medication review, the church donation, Willowbend, the $3,180, the plan to sell the house. I kept my voice clinical, because if I let it become a daughter's voice, I was afraid it would break in a way neither of us could repair. When I finished, my father looked at the binder, then at me. Prairie Home took $54,600, he said. The pharmacy took $118. Your mother moved $27,750 through a church account she thought Ruth would not question. You missed the March transfer. For a second, the room had no sound at all. Not the clock. Not the television. Not even his breathing. I stared at him and felt the floor shift under a truth I had not prepared for. You knew? I asked. My father took a small brass key from the desk drawer and unlocked the blue file box. Inside were bank statements, property records, pharmacy invoices, printed emails, photographs of my care schedule, and pages of his own block handwriting arranged by month. I was a county assessor for 38 years, he said. I do not trust a number unless I know where it came from. I should have felt relieved. Instead, the first thing I felt was grief. Since when? I asked. Month 4, he said. No defense, no softening. Just the fact, placed on the desk between us. I thought about every time I had brought him a strange charge, every time he said he would handle it, every time I mistook quiet for helplessness. My throat burned. And me? I asked. Did you know what they did to me too? His face changed then. Not much. My father was never a man of large movements, but something behind his eyes gave way. Yes, he said, and I thought I was protecting the record. His hand trembled harder against the box. I should have protected you first. By Saturday evening, the house had dressed itself for denial. Judith made pot roast, mashed potatoes, glazed carrots, and the lemon pie she only baked when she needed the room to forgive her before anyone spoke. The dining table was set with the good plates from the hutch. Cloth napkins, silver candlesticks, a pitcher of iced tea sweating onto a lace runner. If you had walked in, without knowing better, you would have thought we were celebrating something. My father's blue file box sat under his chair, tucked beside his left foot like a sleeping animal. Blaire arrived 15 minutes late, which meant she entered with everyone already waiting. That was how she liked rooms. Caleb came behind her, carrying a leather portfolio and a bottle of red wine with a label he turned outward, as if the table might applaud. Blaire kissed my mother's cheek, touched Dad's shoulder, and gave me a smile that never reached her eyes. "You look tired," she said. "Hospice will do that to a person." Caleb glanced around the room and said, "This place really is becoming too much for Ray." Judith did not correct him for calling my father Ray. Dinner moved like theater with bad actors and one patient audience. Blaire asked Dad how he was feeling in the same voice people use for nursing home brochures. Caleb praised Judith's carrots, then waited until the plates were cleared before opening his portfolio. The papers came out clean and clipped, each page marked with a colored tab. "We all want the same thing," he began. That sentence is usually the first lie in any family meeting. Alton needs stability. Judith needs relief. Audrey needs support. The responsible move is to liquidate the Norwalk property before winter expenses make it harder. Blaire slid into her part smoothly. "Audrey has done so much emotionally," she said, pressing one hand to her chest. "But that's exactly why she shouldn't have to carry the decision alone." My mother nodded before Blaire finished, grateful for a sentence that made taking my voice sound like helping me rest. Caleb pushed a signature page toward my father, then another toward me. "This only authorizes us to begin the process," he said. "No one is forcing anything tonight." I looked at the pen beside my plate. It had my mother's church logo on it. My father did not touch the paper. He folded his napkin once, very slowly, and asked, "Prairie Home sends staff on Tuesdays or Thursdays now?" Caleb's eyes moved first. "Not much, but enough." Blaire answered for him. "It varies, Daddy. Care is flexible." Dad nodded like a man accepting weather. "And the medication review on May 14th, he said. "Who performed that?" Caleb sat back, professional smile tightening at the edges. "I would need to check the file." My father looked at him over the rim of his glasses. "Then why was it billed under your pharmacy license?" For the first time all evening, nobody reached for a glass. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen. Somewhere outside, a dog barked twice and stopped. Judith whispered, "Alton, please." Not because she did not understand the question. Because she did. Blaire's hand found Caleb's sleeve. Caleb looked at the papers, then at me, then at my father, measuring which person in the room had become the problem. My father reached down beside his chair, lifted the blue file box, and placed it on the table between the lemon pie and the unsigned forms. "Good," he said quietly. "Now we can talk about what has already been signed." My father opened the blue file box like a man laying out instruments. No hurry, no drama. Just tabs, dates, copies, and the kind of silence that makes guilty people start talking too soon. He placed the first stack in the center of the table. 3 years of statements, he said. Prairie Home Wellness Coordination. $54,600 billed for services nobody provided. Blaire's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Caleb leaned forward slightly, already preparing the voice he used for patients who questioned a price. Dad turned one page with 2 trembling fingers. 11 of those billed visits happened on days Audrey was here. Her care binder shows it. Etta Rain's doorbell camera shows it. No Prairie Home vehicle, no coordinator, no visit. He slid a photograph across the table, then a copy of my handwritten note beside it. I saw my own block letters under the dining room light. No visit, no call, no report received. For the first time in 3 years, my quiet work had a witness. Blaire swallowed hard. "Daddy, you're misunderstanding how care coordination works." My father looked at her the way he used to look at tax maps when a boundary line had been drawn by someone hoping nobody would measure. "Prairie Home LLC was registered 6 weeks after your wedding," he said. "Managing member, Blaire Hensley." Judith made a small sound, not shock exactly, more like grief trying to decide whether it could still protect the person who caused it. Caleb shifted then. His first setting was professional. "Coordination fees are standard. Remote review is common. You're reading raw documents without context." I placed Dr. Vale's letter beside his wineglass. He never ordered those medication reviews, I said. He never received reports from you, and he never authorized billing under your pharmacy. Caleb's jaw tightened. His second setting came faster. Blaire handled the admin. I assumed the services were being routed correctly. Blaire turned toward him slowly, and something in her face went young and ugly with fear. My father was not finished. $118,000 moved into an entity attached to Hensley Family Pharmacy. $27,750 moved through a church account as restoration funds. The care account had $3,180 left when your father needed a $12,000 deposit. He did not raise his voice. That made it worse. Anger can be argued with. Records cannot. Caleb stood. You want to destroy my license over a family misunderstanding? There it was, the word family dragged out like a tarp to cover the shape of what they had done. I looked at the man I had once promised to love in sickness and health, and for the first time, I felt nothing that belonged to a wife. No, I said. You used your license to make theft look medical. I'm just putting your name back on it. Dad opened the final folder. The Norwalk house and 6 acres are in an irrevocable care trust. Miles Keene is trustee. Audrey is care advocate. Judith no longer controls financial approvals. You have 48 hours to sign repayment for $200,350, or the civil complaint and criminal referral go out. He paused, then looked at me. The pharmacy board complaint is Audrey's decision. The room turned toward me, and Blaire finally understood. Her little sister was holding the door. Blaire came to my duplex that night without Caleb. For a second, standing under the porch light with her makeup gone and her hair pulled back, she looked less like my sister and more like the girl who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. Then she opened her mouth. Take the money, she said. Take the house. Take the trust. Take whatever Dad wants to give you. Just don't send that complaint. She did not say she was sorry. She said, if Caleb loses the pharmacy, I have nothing. I looked at her hands. She was twisting the ring I used to wear around her finger, not even realizing she was doing it. What did I have when you took him? I asked. Blaire's face tightened, but no tears came. Maybe she had finally run out of rooms where tears worked. You always survive, she said. And there it was, the family prayer. The reason they could take from me, and sleep afterward. I survived, so in their minds, it had not cost enough to count. Thursday morning, in Miles Keene's conference room, Blaire and Caleb signed the repayment agreement for $200,350. Caleb's attorney read every line like the words might rearrange themselves if he stared hard enough. They did not. The confession of judgment would file automatically if they missed a payment. The care trust stayed intact. Willowbend would be paid. Judith would receive updates, not authority. My work as care advocate would be paid through the trust, with taxes withheld and respite written into the schedule. Then I took out the sealed envelope. Caleb looked at it before he looked at me. That told me everything. This part is not negotiable, I said. You build care that did not happen under a professional license. I teach families to report that. I do not stop, because the chart has my last name in it. Blaire pushed back from the table. You're doing this to win. Her voice cracked on win, like she still believed life was the old pageant stage and I had finally stolen her crown. I looked at my sister, at the woman my parents had spent a lifetime rescuing with pieces of me. No, I said. I stopped competing. That was the truth I had not known, until I heard myself say it. I was not going to hate her for the rest of my life. I was not going to follow her ruin around town collecting applause, and I was not going to confuse mercy with silence ever again. I mailed the complaint that afternoon, then drove to Willowbend with apple turnovers, warm in a paper bag. Dad was sitting by the bird garden when I arrived, one hand resting on the arm of his chair, the other folded over the blanket on his lap. A cardinal landed near the feeder, and he watched it like it had brought news from a country he missed. I cut the pastry into small pieces because his hands were bad that day. He looked at me for a long time and said, You didn't leave the family, Audrey. You were the only one who stayed. I did not answer right away. Some sentences need room before they become part of you. 6 months later, Caleb's pharmacy license was on probation. Hensley Family Pharmacy had lost its expansion funding, and Blaire had sold the townhouse with the white kitchen she used to post every Sunday. My mother learned to ask before touching a document. I learned to let the phone ring sometimes. That was the prize. If there was one. Not revenge. Not being chosen. Just the quiet knowledge that love requiring you to disappear was never love. It was a debt someone else kept spending. In my opinion, this story is not only about betrayal, money, or a broken marriage. At its deepest level, it is about the quiet damage that happens when a family decides one person is strong enough to carry everyone else's pain. Audrey did not suffer because she was weak. She suffered because the people around her used her strength as permission to take from her again and again. What makes the story meaningful is that Audrey's victory is not about getting her husband back or destroying her sister for revenge. She realizes that being chosen by the same people who abandoned her would not truly heal her. If she accepted the old family scoreboard, she would only become another player in the same cruel game. Instead, she chooses something harder and more mature. She protects her father, creates legal boundaries, reports wrongdoing, and stops competing for love that was never given fairly. The most powerful lesson is that love should not require someone to disappear. A family should not ask the most responsible daughter, son, sibling, or caregiver to suffer silently just because they are capable of surviving it. Strength should be respected, not exploited. Caregiving, loyalty, and emotional labor must be seen, valued, and protected. Another important lesson is the value of documentation. Audrey's notes, records, receipts, and quiet observations became the truth when everyone else tried to rewrite the story. Sometimes, justice does not come from shouting louder. Sometimes it comes from writing things down, staying calm, and refusing to let manipulation erase reality. In the end, Audrey does not win because her family finally chooses her. She wins because she stops auditioning for a role in a family system that only loved her when she was useful. Her freedom begins when she understands that real love does not ask you to bleed quietly so other people can stay comfortable.